Howdy. I want to start by differentiating positive thinking from thinking in the positive. I often experience the use of the word positive as being conflated with optimism. So, positive thinking might be looking on the bright side of things, or some sort of affirmation. And in that space, we're thinking that maybe things will work out well in the face of adversity, or we're seeing the silver lining of a bad situation, or maybe we're just telling ourselves nice things about ourselves when we're feeling kind of blue. In some ways, positive thinking is living in a hopeful space with a hopeful perspective on life that may or may not be connected to what's actually present for us. And gosh, I do appreciate this way of thinking sometimes, and I believe it can be very beneficial in certain circumstances. I also see how it might be kind of limiting for our growth. The latter is the case because positive thinking tends to gloss over the actual information that is present. And it is the actual information that is present which is necessary for us to do actual work. In this video, I'm going to share some information about thinking in the positive, which is a different way to approach our thoughts and perspective on the world. So in contrast to positive thinking, thinking in the positive is markedly different because it's about the creation of something, or even the acknowledgement of what is present. Essentially, thinking in the positive challenges us to focus on what is actually here, or maybe what is preferred. In other words, what we want to create. Here we think about the word positive as meaning the presence of something, and negative as the absence of something. So we're thinking about presence and absence. It moves us from a deficit perspective space into a constructive space. Thinking in the positive means identifying what is present instead of identifying what is absent. I hope to give some examples, and I'm probably going to give a couple, that will help elucidate these ideas a little bit further. Now, for example, when I say, I don't know how I feel, the don't know stands out because the don't suggests the absence of something, because it's a contraction of not. So when I ask what is present instead of the not, in essence, shifting my perspective from the absence, the not, to the presence, or the positive, I become aware that there may be multiple feelings that are coming up for me. And as I start to describe them, then I start to get a sense of what is actually occurring within myself. So I might find that, instead of not knowing how I feel, I might notice I have kind of a mixture of things, a little bit of surprise, a little bit of sadness, a little bit of fear. Now, this mixture might result in me saying, I don't know how I feel. Yet, when I start to identify these intersecting elements of emotions, it starts to give me kind of a sense of what I'm actually working with in the present moment. Similarly, if we use that I don't know and we apply it to what I'm going to do today, I can sit with the not again and explore what is present instead of knowing. So I have not knowing. Well, what do I actually know? And what I might know is that I'm struggling. Maybe I'm reflecting on and weighing different options, and I have an awareness of those different potential options. I'm feeling this not knowing because there are different things on the scale for me to consider. And as I weigh out these different options of, the preferences of my family, the weather, the push-pull to do work, or myriad of other considerations, all come onto that scale to be weighed. And it might come to the fore as being, well, I don't know. And if I stay with the I don't know, then I'm going to miss out on the intentional working of those materials, of those options. And in doing so, I miss out on an opportunity to really engage in that. So thinking the positive can emerge from the negative. We find the presence of something when the absence comes up. And the absence is most notable in how we language and experience when we use the word not. It's just an easy way to start to identify that. And there are many contractions to the word not. Words like don't, can't, won't, shouldn't, wouldn't, couldn't. There's certainly other forms of subtly identifying the absence in our language. But the not is a great place to start because our ears can start to track that and pick that up over time. It might be things like, I don't want to feel sad, I can't get all this work done, I won't be appreciated by others. All of these have nots in them, which suggests the absence. So as another example, I remember someone telling me that they were going to see a former romantic partner at an upcoming event. And they said, I don't want to bring expectations for what's going to happen. And gosh, that really resonated with me because I have said similar things in the past. And so sitting there with them and talking, I really projected my own experience into that space. Getting a sense that they didn't want to force things to happen. And they didn't want to anticipate how the other person would react. However, these were all defined by the absence of something, right? So it's just empty space. And that empty space doesn't actually define what we want to bring into that. When we start to think in the positive, we start to explore just that. In other words, what we want to bring with us, what we want to create. In that way, we start to flesh out and imagine what that might look like for us. If we can catch the absences in our language, notice those nots, the opportunity exists to turn it into something positive, something that exists, through really simple questions. And I've already alluded to one of these in the above examples. And it's what in solution-focused counseling is called the great instead. So when we notice the not, we can ask ourselves, what do I want or prefer instead? Answering that question pulls us into thinking about and narrating what we want to create. Similar to the above experience of meeting a former partner, if I was going to a dinner party and started to get nervous about it, I might say or think in the absent, because it's identifying what I'm most afraid of occurring. In other words, I'm focused on trying to create the absence of something. So I might say, I'm not going to be uptight. I'm going to avoid standing next to the cheese plate all night. I'm going to make sure that I don't leave and go home too early. Right there, we hear a lot of absences. Now I imagine that you get a sense of how my intentions are to be engaged in what's going on at this dinner party. Even if I'm thinking in the negative, it's also apparent I haven't described what my engagement will look like or what I'm going to be doing. So instead of being uptight, what am I going to be? All of these statements are about me not doing things. So to answer the question of instead is to start thinking in the positive by creating what I want to see in these spaces. Focusing on the presence of something gives us a sense of what we want to create. Instead of being uptight at this dinner party, I want to be relaxed. And focusing on relax is a great place to start. So if I think about that, what will relax look like in that environment? What would people notice I was doing differently? What would I notice I was doing differently? What are the types of things that I might focus on? Some of the behaviors that I might engage in order to exhibit this and be present with this relaxed way of being. This instead can be applied to all of those absences that I defined for the party. And in doing so, it can switch things around so that I'm focusing on the presence of something, on doing something, rather than avoiding something. All of this gets us into a different type of mindset, one that's creating what we want to bring into the world. And it works on a number of different conceptual levels. Based on constructionist principles, we're narrating or constructing a new story. Behavioral learning might suggest that we're imaginally exposing ourselves to these alternative behaviors. Humanists might view this as being present with the organism and what the organism is experiencing. There are a multitude of other reasons that this might create change. However, regardless of the theoretical why, it helps. It helps having a sense of what is rather than what isn't. Because in having a sense of what is, it gives us a better sense of what we're creating, of what we're doing. The self-awareness that accompanies thinking in the positive is one that is rich in present awareness. It requires that we become aware of what we actually want to create and what we notice in the here and now. In doing so, we are drawing closer to the structure and character of our own unique self. Maybe a small step towards greater individuation. Now, up to this point, the way that I've talked about thinking in the positive has felt largely optimistic because it's largely based on the creation of things. So what do we want to do instead? However, it's a bit more concrete than just positive thinking. Now, this form of thinking in the positive of creating something can have great utility in our lives. However, it's not the only aspect of this type of cognitive process that could be beneficial. Human experience is really multifaceted, and there are these kind of heavier, kind of dirty, uncomfortable feelings that we can have that still need to be integrated into who we are. And we can learn a lot about them if we work on thinking in the positive. Thinking in the positive with these types of materials can deepen and ground us in some of these more difficult feelings. So we might identify how the difficult feelings that we have also hold value in our lives. So with thinking in the positive, we attempt to understand what is present for us, even if what is present for us feels difficult. So we might say, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. And right there we hear the don't. The absence, again. And the absence of what? The absence of meaning. So if I don't know what I'm doing with my life, what do I know instead? And I might know that I'm feeling uncertain and trapped. And these are not comfortable emotions to have or to hold. But similar to the dinner party, we're able to go into those thoughts and describe what's on the other side. In other words, we think in the positive. This serves as a starting point to explore what is actually present for us, or what is real for us in that moment. Uncertainty suggests that I'm considering different options or choices. What's under consideration? Being curious about that. Going into that curious space about what intersecting forces, ideas, passions, drives, pulls, whatever it is, what's coming together. And in understanding that, we get a greater understanding of what's going on inside of us. We can certainly define things by the absence of something, but it's the presence that brings a greater sense of the concrete materials under consideration. Similarly, that sense of being trapped gives us a chance to ask an instead, and it may be we find that something wants to be free instead of being trapped. What part of us wants to be free? What is it that needs to come out, that feels called? What is it in the environment that's trapping this in? These types of curiosities give us more concrete materials to work with, to build on, to dig into, in order to expand our sense of self, in order to free those parts. So moving into the positive starts to identify what's present and then deepens our own self-awareness about what's going on in our internal state. It gives us a sense of what forces and drives are present within us in the present moment. The act of catching the negative and shifting to the positive can happen in our dialogue with ourselves and with other people. When I start to think about this and I try to enact it in my own life, I start to do backflips with my language. I shift, reflect, rephrase in the moments that I notice a knot about to slip off my tongue. It changes the way I talk about things, and I become much more intentional about describing what's present for me. What do I want? What do I feel pulled to create? What do I know to be true for me? Now, there are certainly times that I allow myself to use the word not, because it can be a smoother way to communicate with others. But oftentimes I find that I want to follow up with an instead. So for example, I might say to my spouse, I don't want to go to the store right now. However, I would prefer to go later after I'm done with work. So I'm identifying there's an absence of something I don't want to, right? But there's a presence of something I want to go later. And then how can we work through that together? So we can do this in our conversations with others. And again, noticing our own internal dialogue. Doing this as a journaling activity can also be very powerful work. I'll oftentimes encourage clients, and I'll encourage myself too, to engage in daily journaling that entails only writing in the positive or intentionally addressing any negative or statements that are phrased in the absence. You can deepen and thicken an experience by taking time to notice the negatives, the absences, the nots, and explore pulling yourself into thinking in the positive by identifying what you want instead, or what is present for you instead. Now, I'm certainly not perfect at thinking in the positive. Instead, I'm working on it. And that means I try to notice and correct, and in doing so, I become more aware of where I actually am in my life. And I hope the same for you. It takes a little experimentation, a little practice, and slowly we start to notice this more in our lives. It shifts things and gives us a new way to look at situations. I hope that you give this a little experiment in your own life and see how it might fit and how it might shift. Thanks.